Death of a Derelict, written by Joseph Payne Brennan. That is Joseph Payne Brennan. That's Brennan. Joseph Payne Brennan. One afternoon in early summer, I sat sipping cold sarsaparilla in the Victorian living room of my investigator friend Lucius Leffing. That is Leffing, Leffing. Shades were drawn against the sun. The room was cool and quiet. Leffing sprawled in his favorite chair. As I glanced around at the gaslight fixtures, the mahogany furniture, and Leffing's favorite pieces of Victorian pressed glass, I smiled and I said, "Oh, I suppose that two gentlemen must have sat down, much like this in somebody's parlor back in the so-called grey 90s, don't you think? If I should hear the clop of horses' hooves outside, it would definitely not surprise me." And just then, the doorbell rang. Leffing got up reluctantly, and he said, "Oh, I fear a little reminiscent trip backward into time must be delayed for a more propitious moment. The present seems to be intruding." I heard conversation at the door, and then Leffing ushered in an individual who was not conducive to moods of gentle nostalgia. He was short, fat, fetish, with large tooth smile, which in the dimly lighted room seemed to switch on and off like a neon sign. A suit with a pattern of large cheeks did nothing to enhance his pot-bellied presence. Leffing introduced him as Mr. Clarence Morenda. That is Morenda, Morenda, and waved him into a chair. Glancing around, Mr. Morenda flavored us with another flashing grin, and said, and laughed uproariously, "Well, well, you gentlemen have got yourselves a cozy little highway here." Once the storm had subsided, Leffing informed me of the following thing. "Oh, Mr. Morenda is a manager of the entertainment concession at Frolic Beach. He's here on business, you know." Mr. Morenda, recalled to the purpose of his visit, scowled portentously and said, after clearing his throat, "Oh, my crummy nuisance. That's what it is. But first, you better tell me what this will cost." "Oh, that depends on the particular circumstances, the time consumed, expenses, and so on," Leffing told him and continued. "But, you know, compensation can be decided later. I do not press my clients, you know." After this, Mr. Morenda seemed momentarily confused by such an unbusinesslike attitude. But then he shrugged and grinned again. "Oh, okay, Mr. Leffing. I like a man who don't make too much of money, you know." Leffing nodded and said, "Oh, quite so. And now, tell me, what is your case?" Morenda's shaggy eyebrows stitched together again and said, "About a month ago, we found a stiff in an alley, which runs alongside the cyclone. Head all bashed in. Couldn't figure out whether he had fallen off the cyclone or got slugged. The coroner said he came to his death in a manner at present unknown, or something like that. I honestly don't know. We had seen this bum hanging around for quite a while, but nobody knew his name or anything. They took pictures, and then they kept him on ice, but nothing turned up. So finally, they planted him in putters." He paused, took out a large purple handkerchief and wiped the perspiration from his face, and continued with his narration. "And then, a week ago, this naughty dame shows up. Claims this stiff was her cousin, Joel Carvey. That's Carvey, Karvey. She says that he fell off the cyclone. Claims it was our fault. Now she's getting ready to sue us for $100,000. Oh, imagine that. Why that bomb wasn't worth 2 cents? He snorted. Okay, I appreciate your problem, Mr. Miranda. But I fear you need an astute attorney, a clever one. Not a private investigator, said laughing. After this, Miranda shook his head vigorously and said, "Oh my, those finky shysters! They would keep the case going off for 5 years. I want the suit thrown out before they start chewing on it. That bomb didn't fall at all. He was murdered. And if I can prove that, the suit comes apart at the seams." Laughing winced at the metaphor. Okay, Mr. Miranda, is there any definite evidence to indicate that it was murder, or are you just engaged in wishful thinking? Oh my, sure it was murder! The guy's head was all bashed in, but there wasn't another mark on him. No mark on him. If he had fallen off the cyclone, he would be banged all over. Okay, perhaps he landed on his head, I suggested. Miranda scowled at me impatiently. It ain't likely. He would have to take a real swan dive off on top of the cyclone and drop directly into that little alley. If he fell off, he would hit at every tier, bang into the railings and bounce around. Okay, Mr. Miranda, assuming that you are correct. Why should anyone murder a penniless drifter? Can you suggest a motive? Laughing put it in. At this, Miranda hesitated. Well, I ain't sure. Maybe somebody thought he had a few bills. You know how it is. They'll cost you for a quarter these days. Or maybe he got into a fight with some drunk. Could be lots of things. He spread his hands and shrugged his shoulders. Laughing sat silently for a minute or two. Okay, I will take the case, he said at length. The motive intrigues me. We cannot at this point, of course, rule out the possibility that the drifter's death was an accident. After assuring Mr. Miranda that he would start work on the case the next day, Laughing conducted his new client to the door. Whoa. Well, Brennan, what do you think? What do you think? He asked me as he settled back in his chair. After this, I set down my sarsaparilla glass and I said, "Well, to be honest, the whole sordid business looks pretty obvious to me. This female cousin had the drifter murdered and left near the cyclone so that she could bring a suit against the Frolic Beach. Some rat trap lawyer is scaling place for her. I don't know about you, but that's what I think." "Huh. Well. You may have already solved the case, you know?" Laughing replied with a touch of sarcasm. However, your solution must bear up under investigation. Too much remains to be done." I did not see Laughing again until several days had passed. One evening, I stopped in to ask how the case was coming along. Laughing leaned back in his chair and put his fingertips together. "Okay. I am now convinced that the drifter, Joel Carvey, was murdered. I studied the morgue photographs and talked to the coroner, who incidentally does not agree with me. I believe Carvey was struck over the head by a lead pipe. You know, something made of metal. The coroner thinks, on the other hand, that he struck his head against the iron railings which parallel the cyclone's track along both sides of the structure." Well, but if Carvey fell, I asked, wouldn't he have been seen? You know, someone probably must. Laughing shook his head. "Oh no, quite possibly not. Not if he fell at night. The cyclone is not too well lighted, and the alley in which he was found is dark. There is also the possibility, as the coroner pointed out, that he climbed up on the cyclone after closing hours, midnight, as a lark, or just to get a view of the harbor lights. Highly unlikely, I said. Well, where murder is suspected, or where 100,000 lawsuits are pending, one cannot dismiss possibilities. This, I grunted. Well, to be honest, I can't believe a drifter would be riding around on the cyclone or climbing up to see the harbor lights. I still think this female cousin had him killed. That's what I think. I don't know about you, Leffing. Well, Leffing continued, the female cousin is a charred woman living in Newbridge, a drab, unimaginative creature with no criminal connections that I can discover. She mentioned to someone that the dead drifter was a distant relative. An opportunistic attorney learned that the circumstances, and he descended upon her. He will obviously be rewarded only if he wins the case. Oh, so you are convinced Carvey was murdered? I asked. Well, the head wounds indicate assault, so far as I can judge from the photographs and autopsy descriptions. What baffles me is the motive. Why should anyone murder such a nondescript beggar? Leffing said. I had no further questions or suggestions to offer, but the case began to interest me, and I made Leffing promise to keep me informed. When I stopped back, a week later, he was restless and fretful. So you have made no progress, right, Leffing? He stopped pacing the floor and sat down. Oh my, the motive, Brennan, the motive! I am now more firmly convinced that the female cousin is innocent, but we have no other suspect. Huh? Well, but how about Morenda himself? I asked. Well, he had no reason to kill Carvey. Well, suppose, I said, Carvey fell off the cyclone. He was found injured, but conscious, and threatened to bring suit. Maybe Morenda finished him off to avoid getting hauled to court. Leffing frowned, and he said, Oh my, an unpleasant possibility I must admit I had not entertained, alright? I didn't think about that. But, if Morenda finished off Carvey as you said, why would he seek help to prove Carvey was murdered? If he is brash enough to risk his own life or freedom in order to nullify a lawsuit. I nodded, and I said, well, I believe he may be bold and callous enough to take the risk. All he wants you to do is to establish the fact that Carvey was murdered in order to end the lawsuit. If he himself is guilty, he must be confident that you can never prove it. Probably he believes he would never be suspected. Well, now that you say that, Brennan, I do intend to question him again, in any case. We will see then what turns up, Leffing said. So you have learned nothing more at all? I asked presently. Well, one minor thing. Insignificant perhaps, yet puzzling. Carvey never did any work at the concessions, and he was never seen panhandling, yet he always seemed to have a little money, enough for hamburgers, chips, soda, and so forth. Morenda hoped to get him arrested for begging and thus get rid of him. He even had the Frolic Beach watchman, Henry Marnault, that's Marnault, Marnault, spy on him at intervals, but Marnault never caught him panhandling. Well, he may have been a pickpocket. Doubtful. That's totally doubtful. If he pickpockets, he must have been an accomplished professional. He had never been arrested for anything except vagrancy. A professional of his age, he was about 60, would certainly have a police record. Okay, so what's your next move? Well, tomorrow afternoon I'm going to make another visit to Frolic Beach. I will see Miranda again and then perhaps prowl about. Would you care to accompany me? Frolic Beach, south of New Haven, along the Sound, is a cluster of carnival-like concessions, interspersed with hamburger stands, popcorn palaces, lemonade stalls, and several surprisingly good restaurants. Early afternoon found Leffing and myself walking down Lavender Street, the main thoroughfare which bisects the beach area. Miranda's office was located in a dingy building behind the merry-go-round. He glanced up from a sheaf of greasy-looking sales slips as Leffing and I entered. "Oh, you got any news for me, Mr. Leffing?" Leffing shook his head. "Well, to be honest, nothing fresh, Mr. Miranda. Can you take time out to stroll about a bit? Perhaps another visit to the scene of the crime might be helpful." "Okay, sure. But we've been there before." He left his sales lips with obvious reluctance to accompany us. Screaming couples were rocketing about on the cyclone track when we arrived. The alley in which Carvey had been found ran along one side of it, a dim, narrow ladle lane, empty, totally empty, except for candy wrappers, bottle caps, and a piece of yellowed newspaper. We found Leffing inside. He poked about for a time and then stood looking up at the cyclone. Suddenly, he pointed out the following thing. "Well, a section of the railing up there was recently replaced, Mr. Miranda. Is that correct?" Both Miranda and I squinted upward. Most of the iron pipe railing looked old and rusty, but there was one small section which appeared shiny and bright. Miranda nodded his head and then said, "Yeah, a piece got loose up there. So we had a new section put a couple of months ago, I think." "Okay then, where was the old piece of railing left?" Leffing asked. "Was it by any chance discarded in this alley?" At this, Miranda scratched his chin, and he said, "Well, might be. I never paid any attention, you know. You think that bomb got bashed with it, right, Mr. Leffing?" "Well, to be honest, I believe it highly possible. That might be why the coroner thinks Carvey fell. The wounds on his head would indicate that pipe railing caused them. But in my opinion, it was a discarded piece left lying in the alley here, which did the job. That's definitely what happened." "Oh, if we could locate it, we might have fingerprints, don't you think?" I exclaimed. "Well, I must say that's quite possibly. But the murderer probably walked a few yards down to the beach and hurled it into the breakers. We would have a Herculean task recovering it, and any fingertips would be scored off by now." At this idea, Miranda shook his head, and he said, "My God, no. You sure got all the answers, Mr. Leffing?" He suddenly broke into a roar of laughter. "All except for the big answer. Who killed Carvey? Huh? You don't have that answer." He went on laughing like a hysterical hyena. If Leffing was annoyed, he gave no sign. "I must say that you're right, Mr. Miranda. The big answer still eludes me," he said quietly when the raucous hee-hawing had subsided. As we walked back towards Moranda's office, Levin inquired about Henry Marnold, the Frolic Beach watchman. "Oh, we got a real bad worry about fire. After midnight, when we close, Henry checks up on all the rides and stands. You know how it is. A smoldering butt could bring down the works," Miranda explained. "And that is the extent of Marnold's duties?" Levin asked. "Well, his night tour takes about 2 hours. Then he goes off and doesn't come on again till 4 in the next afternoon. He sweeps my office and does a few odd jobs, but mostly he just drifts around picking up soda bottles and stuff. Sometimes, if a stand runs out of change, he'll bring a bill to my office. We don't push Henry, really. It's already really hard to get a man for that ride tour. For that night tour." "Okay. And where does he live?" Levin asked. "Well, he lives in a barn down off at the end of Lavender Street. Fix it up for him, and we don't charge any rent. He got all he needs in there," Mr. Miranda explained. "Okay, well, we may just have a chat with him, if you have no objection," Levin nodded. "Oh, sure. Please, leave no stone unturned, as they say, Mr. Levin." We left Miranda and walked down Lavender Street, stopping over for a lemonade along the way. As he turned in towards the barn, however, we saw that this was his habitual way of walking. Marnold looked up at us suspiciously out of somewhat bloodshot eyes, but he became friendly enough when Levin explained his errand. "Oh, Carvey, yeah, sure. I knew who he was. Mr. Miranda had me watching him for a while. We figured he was just panhandling, but I never did catch him at it. Slippery cuss, but I ain't got no information about him. He just hung around and he never talked to anybody." "He never did. Never talked to nobody." "So, do you think he was murdered?" Levin asked. Marnold ran a hand through his ragged hair. "Nah. Who would want to kill him? He wasn't worth killing at all, a bum like that. But I don't think he fell off the cyclone. I figure he just climbed up there one night and then jumped." "Okay, but what reason do you think he could have had for suicide?" Levin asked. Marnold tapped his head. "Well, he was loose up there." "Eh? He was loose up here. Those kind of people get crazy urges like that." Levin nodded. "Well, you may be right, Mr. Marnold. You may be right." And then he could tell us nothing more. Levin thanked him, and we started back up Lavender Street. "Well, I think that if Carvey committed suicide, we are wasting our time," I pointed out. "Well, there are worse ways of wasting it, Brennan. We have the tang of sea air, and fresh lemonade is just at hand." Levin then began a series of inquiries which exasperated me and eventually left me exhausted. He stopped at every stand and stall along Lavender Street and inquired about Carvey. Did they remember him? Did he ever buy food or drink from that particular stand? How did he pay for it? By the time I fell into my car for the drive back to New Haven, my legs were literally aching. Levin, apparently immune to fatigue, was in a rather optimistic mood. Well, Brennan, I think the case is clearing. I can't recall that you learned anything of consequence from the various vendors along Lavender Street." "I don't know about you, but I saw nothing," I said. "Well, come on. You attach no significance to the fact that Carvey invariably paid for his food and drink with coins, usually nickels and dimes. Well, the only significance I attach to it is that he was an elusive and hard-working panhandler," I replied. Levin would say no more. He began humming an old English music hall ballad. This went on until we arrived back at Autumn Street. He turned to me as I stopped the car in front of his small house. "Brennan, are you willing to drive me down to Frolic Beach tomorrow morning? About 5 o'clock? I groaned. "Oh, good grief. Are we going in pursuit of a murderous milkman?" Leffing laughed. "I think not, but we must have a clearly early start." "Okay, I'll be right here at 5 o'clock, I told him. I knew it would be useless to question him. He loved being both melodramatic and secretive, and I had to come to accept the irritating fact that apparently he could not be cured of this deplorable childishness. I set up my alarm for 4:30, and I was still sleepy as I stopped in front of 7 Autumn Street. It was just beginning to get light. A heavy fog filled the streets. Moments after I pulled up, a disreputable-looking figure appeared out of nowhere, slouched up to the car, and yanked open the door. I turned up in alarm. What do you want?" The tramp leered at me. "I want to live down to Frolic Beach. That's where you're headed. Ain't it, Brennan? Ain't it? Brennan?" I stared at him for a full half-minute before the import of his words came through. "Leffing? Oh my God. You've given me another gray hair." He got in the car. "Sorry, Brennan. Did my little disguise take you in?" I shook my head to deny that. "My God, I had no idea you were a master of makeup. Where did you learn the art?" "Oh, in my distant youth I was identified with several amateur theatrical groups. At various times, my early stage experience has proved invaluable. You know, you never know when these kind of skills will come in handy." Traffic was light, but the fog slowed us up considerably. Everything chatted out and chatted about everything except the case at hand. I remained completely mystified as to the reason for his disguise. We parked a few blocks from the beginning of Lavender Street. Leffing peered cautiously through the fog. "Okay, no more talking, Brennan. And remain close to the buildings. We must not be seen." We skulked down Lavender Street single file, like a pair of thieves. About halfway down, Leffing nudged me into a doorway. He whispered and said, "We will take our stand here. We must not move." The light strengthened and the fog lifted a bit as we waited. Suddenly, Leffing squeezed my hand and then my arm and nodded at me. Inching out, I looked down Lavender Street. At the far end, a shambling figure came into sight. In the fog, he looked like a wraith beginning to materialize. He kept his head bent forward and down, twice, as we watched. He bent swiftly and seemed to pick something out of the street. The weird behavior was repeated several more times as he approached. When he drew closer, Leffing edged slowly into the street and began to stroll towards him. I just watched, puzzled but fascinated, and now Leffing stooped and appeared to pick up something. He seemed to be entirely oblivious to the figure coming towards him from the other end of the street. As the other figure slowly emerged from the fog, I finally recognized the features of Henry Marnault, the Frolic Beach watchman. He kept his head bent and his eyes on the ground most of the time, so he did not see the disguised form of Leffing until they were less than a block apart. He stopped in his tracks and stared. Leffing continued shuffling forward. At intervals, he bent to pluck something from the gutters. Marnault watched him like a man bewitched. He seemed frozen into immobility. When he found his voice, it was a high-pitched, frantic, filled with rising hysteria. "Carvey? Carvey, get back! You are dead, you crazy bum! I killed you! Carvey! What's the hell? Carvey, come back here! You are dead, you crazy bum! I killed you! Get away from me! I killed you! Get away from me!" As Leffing continued towards him, Murnau turned him with a scream and began to run down Lavender Street. Leffing straightened up, drew something from a pocket, and put it to his lips. Shrill blast of a police whistle cut through the foggy morning air. A moment later, a blue-clad figure came pounding from somewhere out of the fog, and collared the terrified Marnault. Leffing called out in his voice, "Ah, splendid work, Sergeant Corliss. Arrest the man, that man, for the murder of Joel Carvey." "Alright, that's Joel Carvey, Joel Karvey. Marnault signed a full confession later in that day, admitting that he had slugged Carvey over the head with a piece of pipe railing found in the alley next to the Cyclone. He had dragged Carvey into the alley, walked to the shore, and thrown the murder weapon into the ocean. This had occurred just at daybreak, when the Frolic Beach area was still deserted. He had killed Carvey, he explained, because Carvey, in spite of repeated threats, had continued to muscle in on his territory. Marnault had found that an early morning inspection of the Frolic Beach streets, gutters, and sidewalks almost invariably yielded a modest crop of coins. The area, which was open until midnight, was not well lighted. Many coins dropped during the evening remained waiting to be picked up on the following morning. Marnault had averaged enough to pay for his weekly bottle of gin. Then, Carvey had drifted in. One morning, Marnault had run into him prowling the gutters in search of coins. The watchman had warned him to leave, but Carvey had remained. Morning after morning, Marnault ran into the drifter, and the watchman's daily harvest of coins dwindled even lower. The amount involved was small, but so was Marnault's salary, and the bottle of gin was important to him. At length, his irritation had turned into murderous rage. Finally, one foggy morning, he had waited in the little alley next to the Cyclone, where he had picked up a length pipe railing. Carvey's coin collecting had come to an abrupt end. That evening, I sat in Leffing's gaslit Victorian living room while he poured a generous portion of his choice, mellowed brandy. So delicious. I sampled it with relish. I commented the following thing. It certainly was a bizarre murder motive, you know. But two things still puzzle me. Why was Marnault so terrified when he saw you approaching in the fog? And how did you figure out the business in the first place? Now that's some great detective work right there, and I have to compliment you and applaud your actions. After sipping a little bit of the brandy, Leffing smiled and replied and said, while smiling, well, Marnault was terrified because I had made up to resemble Carvey, you know? As I told you, it is a really good skill to know how to wear makeup and to make me look like whatever. I had studied the more pictures, you know? I made up my face to look like his, and I had even scoured the second-hand shops to get some rags of clothing which resembled his own. It was a gamble, of course, but hey, surprise, surprise, it worked. After this, he set down his glass, and he continued. Well, from the very beginning, the motive interested me. It eluded me for some time. Then, I began to speculate as to Carvey's source of money. He never worked, and he was never seen begging, yet he always seemed to have a few coins, just a few. Where did he get them from? I was still groping in the dark until that day when we went to see Arnold. When I saw him approaching, I immediately tagged him as a stooper, a tramp term for a person who scrounges around looking for coins in the gutters and streets. Arnold had no physical deformity. The bent head and constant downcast eyes therefore could mean only one of two things: atrocious posture arising out of sloth and indifference, or the habitual stance of a confirmed stupor. I was not sure of myself at first, but when I canvassed the stall operators and found that Carvey almost invariably paid for his snacks with small coins, after this point I felt that I had found a motive for his murder. At this I shook my head, and I said, "Oh well, it seems unbelievable to me that a man would murder for a few miserable coins snatched out of the gutter." Leffing shrugged. Those miserable coins meant a regular weekly bottle of gin. And to a person such as Arnold, alcohol can become pretty important. A whimsical grin touched his thin face. "Oh, speaking of alcohol, Brennan, would you care for another brandy?" I held out my glass.